Today is November 27th, 2013. We are at the Sedona Public Library in Sedona, Arizona, which is an official partner with the Veterans History Project of the Library of Congress. Today I'm interviewing Joseph Edward Gutierrez, who was born in October of 1934. Joe served in the U.S. Navy from 1967 until 1969, and he was, his ultimate rank was Lieutenant Commander. He was in the 1st Medical Battalion, 1st Marine Division, and he served during the Vietnam War. Joe, tell us a little bit about your family background.
Well, I was born in Manila in the Philippine Islands, and part of my reason for being interested in the military, both of my grandfathers served in the military, and every generation since my grandfathers served in the military except for the Coast Guard. We've had branches of the family in the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force. My maternal grandfather was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts. He went to the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. The war was just about over at that time. He went back to Boston, and he said he suffered through a horrible, horrible blizzard and decided he would prefer to be in a warmer climate. So he went back to the Philippines, married my grandmother, and fathered 13 children. My mother was the oldest of 13, so that was my mother's side of the family. My father's side of the family fought on the other side of the Spanish-American War. My grandfather, my paternal grandfather, served in the Spanish-American War for the Philippine Army during the Philippine insurrection against Spain. And then when the Spaniards left, when the Americans came, they thought that the American Army was the replacement for the Spanish Army and turned around and fought them. They finally realized that was not the right thing to do, and peace came about. So on my father's side, my grandfather served under General Aguinaldo, who was the rebel general, Philippine general, and my maternal grandfather served on the American side. And every generation since then has had people in the Army, and I think in the Navy we were among the last. But the Army, the Air Force, then the Marine Corps, and the Navy, except the Coast Guard. So that's how I got to get into the military.
Did you you enlist, or were you drafted?
I enlisted.
You enlisted.
All through college and graduate school, medical school, internship, residency, and my fellowship. My draft board kept on giving me educational deferments. And so when I was finishing my residency in surgery, I thought it was time to pay back, and I went down to the draft board in Milwaukee. I went to medical school in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Marquette University. I went down to the draft board and was in a room pretty much like this room. And in each corner of the room was somebody from the Army, somebody from the Navy, somebody from the Air Force, somebody from the Marine Corps. And I went around to see where I could get the best deal. The Navy sounded intriguing. Up until that point, I only had one cousin that had served in the Navy, and the Navy recruiter was quite an interesting gentleman. And he said, you know, if you serve in the Navy, you'll wear nice white uniforms, you'll sit at a table with nice white tablecloths, you'll be served by stewards in nice white uniforms, you'll be served nice meals, you'll be away from the mud and the dust and the dirt. And I thought, boy, that's for me. So I signed my commission with the Navy, and when I got back to my residency program, and my chief of surgery, professor of surgery, found out I had signed up, he blew a gasket. He wasn't very happy with that. He wanted me to be his chief resident and fellow, and so he said, after a few choice words, which I won't mention, don't do anything, just lay quiet. And sure enough, 3 days later, I got a letter from a telegram actually, from the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery that my deferment was being extended another year. So I managed to finish as a chief administrative resident and did my fellowship in vascular surgery. And then the next year, I went back to the draft board, and the same recruiting gentleman was still there, and he said, you know, I don't know what kind of connections you have in Washington, but they sure, you know, did a very good job giving you another deferment. So then I went back and re-signed my commission. When I got back to the hospital, and my chief found out what I had done, he again blew a gasket, because he knew I'd always been interested in probably going into pediatric surgery. And in those days, the best pediatric surgical training in the world was at the Children's Hospital in Boston. And my chief and the chief of surgery at the Boston Children's Hospital were very close friends, and they were willing to take me there sight unseen without an interview. But at that point, I told my chief, it's time to pay back. I've been given all these deferments. There's a war going on. Time to go in and serve. And so I went and signed up my commission, and not too long after that, I was in the service.
And where did you go initially?
My initial 3 weeks in the military were at Camp Lejeune, Medical Field Service School at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. And I met a lot of later colleagues over there. When I finished with 3 weeks in Camp Lejeune, then my first hospital assignment was the Naval Hospital in Chelsea, Massachusetts. And interestingly enough, the ward that I was assigned to was the ward, sick officers' quarters, or the officers' ward. And that's the ward where the late President Kennedy actually served, actually was hospitalized after he was injured in his PT boat during the Second World War. So it was quite interesting to walk into that ward, and it had a big plaque that testified to the fact that that's where the late President Kennedy had been hospitalized. Quite interesting. From there, I could not find housing in the Boston area. That was September by that time. And getting into October, my oldest daughter was starting school, and I couldn't find housing because Boston is a very, very popular area, many universities, many hospitals. People came in for training, and affordable housing was not available. So I went down to Washington and went to the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery of the Navy, and I asked them to go ahead and send me to Vietnam, since that was what they were planning for me anyway. Well, their plans were for me to stay in Boston and work with a doctor at Harvard University Medical School who was doing research on artificial blood. And then after that 1 year in Boston, then to go to Vietnam and probably continue with their experiments testing out artificial blood. The senior resident at my training program, who had finished 2 years ahead of me, had gone that route, and I guess the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery of the Navy intended for me to follow in his footsteps. But I couldn't find any housing, so I asked to go to Vietnam, and they said, well, you might be out on the field with the troops, and I said, no problem. And so in a couple of weeks, I was on my way to Treasure Island in San Francisco. I sat around for about 10 days, each day checking the manifest to see whether they had me on a flight to Vietnam. Nothing. And after 10 days, then I finally got on a flight and wound up in Okinawa. And I sat there for another 10 days, waiting for a flight into Vietnam. And interestingly enough, I was supposed to get a yellow fever shot, but they didn't have enough people that signed up for the shots. You had to have 10 people sign up for shots because that's how many doses there were in a vial. And so I did get into Vietnam without the yellow fever shot. Anyhow, after 10 days, my name was on the manifest, and so on Thanksgiving Day, 1967, never forget it, I was on a flight to Vietnam. And I thought, you know, it's Thanksgiving Day. The box lunch they give us on an airplane should be something to do with turkey. Well, I don't know who planned that meal, but we got the most tasteless and flavorless macaroni and cheese box that I ever had. To this day, macaroni and cheese is something I avoid if I can avoid it. We did make it into Vietnam. It was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It was about 101 degrees in the shade, and as I stepped onto the top of the ramp to walk down, it was like walking into a sauna. But the stewardess was a pretty young lady, and she gave me a big hug and a kiss, and she said, "Good luck, Doc. Hope you make it back into here." And I said, "Thank you very much." And that was my first day in Vietnam.
Where did you go? Where were you quartered?
It was the first medical battalion was just beyond an area in Vietnam, just outside DaNang, called Freedom Hill, which all the troops enjoyed. Everybody in the hospital enjoyed it because there was a PX at Freedom Hill. There was a big PX there, and that's where they went and spent their hard-earned money. But I was assigned to the 1st Medical Battalion, 1st Marine Division, the Fleet Marine Force, and I was supposed to be the replacement for the chief of surgery there, who left shortly after I got there, and so that was my first assignment. First excitement came about 3 or 4 weeks after I got there, just between Christmas and New Year, somewhere in that time period. The ammunition dump at the airstrip in DaNang, which was about maybe a mile from where we were, got hit, and the DaNang Valley lit up like a baseball field at a night game on the 4th of July. And it burned day and night for about 3 days. Got a lot of casualties out of that. And that was the first excitement. The second excitement came in February of 1968. So a few months after I got there, it was the now infamous Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive lasted about a week in all of Vietnam, except in Hue. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were in the citadel, the old walled city in Hue, and that battle lasted for about 3 weeks, almost a month. And at the end of that, I was the first American medical officer actually to go into the old imperial city of Hue. It used to be a very beautiful city and was completely destroyed by the shelling and the bombing. The Vietnamese wanted us to shell it and bomb it, but it was a very historic site, and so we preferred that if they wanted it shelled, that they do it themselves, and they did.
You hadn't had much training, I don't suppose, and nor any experience with the kind of trauma cases that you encountered in Vietnam.
Yes, well, I worked at did most of my work in Milwaukee during my residency at the old Milwaukee County Hospital. And any county hospital, in any big city hospital, weekends are always what we call the weekend of the knife and gun club. A lot of shootings, a lot of stabbings, a lot of auto accidents. Milwaukee's a big beer town, so we had our share of people that had a little bit too much alcohol circulating and tempers getting out of control. So we had a lot of trauma that we saw. So seeing a lot of trauma in Vietnam wasn't too different from the trauma that we saw. There were a lot of gunshot wounds. The flak jacket, I thought, was a very, very valuable bit of progress in terms of protecting the troops. most of the injuries we saw actually were from the groin down. The trunk and the torso was pretty well protected by flak jackets, so that was a big plus. But we did see some serious injuries to the upper body. Usually, when the troops either did not put on their flak jackets because of the hot temperatures, or when they left the flak jacket open in front, then we saw some serious injuries. We also saw a lot of injuries to the Vietnamese civilians. And that was really the saddest part. The troops on the American side, our side, we knew where our next meal was coming from. We knew who would take care of us if we got hurt. The Vietnamese, same thing. They were an organized army, and they knew who would take care of them. But it's the poor civilian that gets caught in the middle. That's the big problem. They never know where their next meal is coming from, and if they got injured, they never knew who was to take care of them. So we did a lot of caring for the Vietnamese civilians. I ran regular medcaps, we call them medical civil action patrols, where we went out into the hinterlands, into the woods, into the small villages. We had to take off our military insignia so they couldn't identify as being officers, and took care of the Vietnamese children, men and women. In Hue, the city hospital in Hue was designed to hold about 1,000 patients. It was a large campus. And when I was there, we probably had about 5,000 patients. And we'd sometimes have 2, 3, or 4 patients in the same bed. On the obstetrical unit, not unusual to see 3 mothers with their babies lying crisscross across the bed with their babies. We kept them for about 1 day and then sent them home. On the surgical floors, because of the lack of surgical equipment, and we had no Vietnamese doctors out there. All the Vietnamese doctors were in the Vietnamese army. So we would put a patient with a right leg fracture in the same bed with another patient with a left leg fracture so that they could share the same traction apparatus. We didn't have enough Foley catheters, so we made sure that as we operated on Vietnamese patients, we scheduled them in such a way that after one patient had his catheter removed, then we had it washed and sterilized and could use that catheter on the next patient. We didn't have enough surgical drains, so we cut our rubber gloves to use as surgical drains. One had to be very innovative and had to use one's imagination to take care of the Vietnamese patients. So I had a group of my fellow surgeons and anesthesiologists and our corpsmen who volunteered to come out to the civilian hospital in Hue, and we did that at least once a week. We had to wait until the minesweepers had checked the highway between Phu Bai, where we were stationed, and Hue, which was a couple of miles away. But after that was done, then we could go out to the hospital, and it was like a gypsy camp. They did not have any kitchen facilities. There were very entrepreneurial citizens of Hue who had their campfires going on the campus grounds, cooking large pots of food, pho, the traditional Vietnamese noodle soup, and they would sell the food to the patients and their families. I got some volunteers to give up some of their blankets. Many of my fellow officers, we gave up some of our blankets, and then we cut the blankets in half so that the Vietnamese were rather small people, and then half a blanket would cover a patient very nicely. So we got to provide blankets for 2 patients with every blanket that we got. Very interesting.
How were you resupplied?
How were we resupplied?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we were very lucky. There were airplanes that came into the DaNang Air Base on a fairly regular basis. and brought in our supplies that way. We were very fortunate that the runway was long enough at DaNang that huge C-141 airplanes flown by the Air Force would come in, and we could put in all our patients in there. Injured patients who we thought could come back to active duty within a few weeks usually were kept in country. Those that had rather serious injuries that probably required them to be mustered out of the military, then we shipped them back usually to the nearest air base to where they lived. They usually flew into either Hawaii or into Alaska first, and then from there on to some other airport that was close to where they lived.
You, excuse me. Sorry. You were operating under sort of difficult conditions, even though you were resupplied often. Did you ever feel kind of overwhelmed and think, oh my gosh, what have I gotten into?
Not really. I was in my middle 30s, so at that point in time, you can take quite a bit of stress. During Tet, I think the most I operated for 37 straight hours one night during Tet. That was not easy. I weighed about 140 pounds at the time, and my chief of surgery, or the chief of the hospital, expected us to operate with a helmet on, a flak jacket on, a heavy web belt with a .45 caliber pistol on, and I told him I can't operate that way. I had to take off the helmet, I had to take off the flak jacket, I have to leave that pistol on the floor, and eventually I had to take my boots off because my feet were swelling. And I told him, I said, well, Skipper, what are you going to do if I don't put on my helmet and wear my flak jacket? Are you going to send me to Vietnam? And he just laughed. But during the Tet Offensive, by that time we had the must units. In Korea they call them the MASH units. In Vietnam we called them the MUST units, M-U-S-T, Medical Unit Self-Contained Transportable. And they were wonderful to operate in. They were completely furbished trailers, air-conditioned, nice lighting, not much space to move around, but very, very comfortable. The hospital itself, we used old Quonset hut type buildings, and every time a helicopter came by, it just blew in handfuls of dust. They were not very good conditions for operating on. But during Tet, we were lucky, so that was fortunate to operate in a MUST unit, and there are even better units now. We had adequate supplies of blood for the most part. The only thing that I was short on, I did not have Fogarty catheters. Fogarty catheters are very, very thin, slender catheters, with a little balloon at the end, and they come in various sizes, from 1 millimeter up to about 7 or 8 millimeters. They're used to extract blood clots from an artery or a vein. So these young soldiers, Marines, would step on a booby trap or a bungee stick, and there were a lot of injuries to the lower extremities. The flak jacket protected the torso. So anytime we had a vascular injury and you had to do a repair on an artery or a vein or both, then you had to put a catheter down below the point of injury to make sure that there were no clots below where you had operated. Otherwise, the blood wouldn't flow. And the Marine Corps resupply system at that time was not what I thought it should be. And I wrote a friend of mine who was at the Naval Hospital at Great Lakes in Evanston, Illinois. And I wrote him and I said, Stuart, why don't you send me some Fogarty catheters? I said, you know, you're in a nice, fancy naval hospital, and you eat on a table with white tablecloth, and you get served by a steward wearing a white uniform, and you wear an antiseptic white uniform. why don't you send me some Fogarty catheter? The steward was a nice guy. He was 1 year ahead of me in training. Then he said, you know, I better do this for you because I may wind up having you be my chief sooner or later, which really did happen. But anyway, he sent me a big box of Fogarty catheters. Fogarty catheters are about a yard long. And so, you know, he had a sense of humor. And Marine Corps colonel did not have a sense of humor. And so here came this big box, and he labeled it fishing equipment because the box was almost that long. So one evening, the colonel up at headquarters called me in and he said, you know, I'm going to have you court-martialed. And I said, what did I do? He said, you're getting fishing equipment. And he thought I'd probably playing hooky and going fishing instead of taking care of patients. And I tried to explain to him that these were Fogarty catheters, and I had to bypass the marine supply system, which worked out of Philadelphia at that time, with some very modern computer equipment known as IBM cards. And he'd had a couple of drinks, let's put it that way, and he was a little bit on the belligerent side. And he said, you know, I'll have you court-martialed for not following protocol and bypassing the supply system. You know, and I got a little bit upset at that point, and I'm sorry that I lost control. But anyway, I told him, I said, you know, Colonel, your problem is you're trying to save taxpayers' money at the expense of taxpayers' sons. And I said, if you try and get me court-martialed, I will start a congressional inquiry. And at that point, he turned almost as red as my shirt and babbled something that was not too recognizable to untrained ears, and got up and left. And I had my Fogarty catheters and saved a lot of lower extremities that way. We were very happy.
Did you have X-ray equipment and CAT scan equipment and things like that?
No, we did not. We had regular X-rays. They were not very powerful because they had to be portable. We did not have any CT scans. Those came much later. We didn't have any scans at all. So you had to have good clinical judgment, and I was very fortunate. I was chief of surgery. My vice chief of surgery, who was my best friend in the military, his name was George Voss. Joe Montelarica knows him. And we became good friends. Even after the service, we remained very good friends until the day he died. So he was excellent. He was an excellent surgeon. So he was my triage officer. And when he came in and said, this patient you have to open up his abdomen, and he's probably got bullet hole or fragment hole in his colon, one in his liver, probably one in his spleen. And when I opened up that patient, George was right. So it was a very good combination.
Okay. I forgot to say who all is here, so I'm going to do that at the end of the interview. Please don't let me forget. I should have said it at the beginning. Did you have any patient that was particularly challenging, or patients that were particularly challenging, or anybody that you weren't able to treat properly because of the lack of supplies?
A couple. That's why I had the problem with the Fogarty catheters. One big drawback that we had was we did not have a chance to follow some of the serious patients long term. You got the patient in, the patient was very sick, very badly injured. You did your best for the patient, and as soon as the patient was stabilized, we put them on an airplane and they're back to Elmendorf or back to Washington or someplace close to their home. So we did not have the close follow-up. Part of being a good doctor or being a good surgeon is being able to follow that patient and see whether you did the right thing, and if you didn't, could you correct it? And that, unfortunately, we were not able to do. There were a lot of patients also that came in, and they're so badly injured, there was just nothing you could do to save them. You did your best. Fortunately, there were not too many of those, but that's part of being a surgeon. You have to learn that sometimes you just can't do it and pull that patient out. They're too far gone. Mm-hmm. That's the sad part.
Absolutely. You were in surgery. Was there a different unit that took care of people who contracted various diseases? You mentioned that you didn't get your yellow fever shot, but I imagine there were a lot of tropical diseases that people were not.
Well, those were usually handled by the internists. So, unless it was a surgical problem, and practically all the surgical problems, we had an occasional hernia and an occasional acute appendicitis, but most of what we took care of was trauma. These are young, healthy, very vigorous young men, thank God, and they could take a lot of trauma, and they did, and we could pull those men out. But the tropical diseases and some venereal diseases were taken care of by our internists.
So most of the people who were treated under your direction.
Yes, and they were treated, the ones that I took care of and supervised had problems of trauma.
Mm-hmm. What was the average length of stay in the hospital for the patient?
For our patient, for surgical patients, the very serious ones, the average length of stay was 1 day.
Oh.
As soon as we got them stabilized, provided the weather was good enough that an airplane could come in and evacuate them out. Air Force was wonderful. They sent those huge airplanes in, knowing that we had to get those troops out because in case we got overrun, in case of a big battle going on, you didn't want to be sitting around with a whole bunch of your patients lying in their bed, unable to help themselves. So our aim was always to get those patients out into much better medical care as soon as we could. Those that we thought could be back at duty, short term, had minor shrapnel injuries, we kept those in. Most of them stayed in probably about 5 days to a week, and then they were back at duty.
How was that coordinated with getting the patients evacuated? Did you?
I didn't have to do that.
Were you in charge of that?
No, I didn't have to do that myself. Fortunately, the administrative part of the hospital took care of that. So the hospital commander and his staff took care of all the evacuation problems. They took care of notifying next of kin and notifying the Air Force that we needed an airplane with whatever number of patients we had to transfer out. And Air Force, like I said, the cooperation between the services was really superb.
What about civilians who had that kind of serious injury?
I'm sorry?
What about civilians who had that kind of serious injury? Were they evacuated as well, or?
No, that was a big problem. When the civilian hospital in Hawaii did not open till about 9 o'clock, at least was not open to us until about 9 o'clock in the morning, because we had to wait until the highway had been checked out by the minesweepers to make sure that there were no mines in the road and that there were no snipers on either side of the road. So we usually did not get to the provincial hospital in Hawaii until about 9 o'clock in the morning. And very often, by the time we got there, there was a holding area just outside the hospital. And as I mentioned, this was designed as a 1,000-bed hospital. We had about 5,000 patients in there, and no house staff. They had some midwives, and basically it was the patient's family who was taking care of the patients. And it was not unusual to come in and see patients that had sustained shrapnel injuries waiting outside in that waiting area. until we got there to take care of them. One of the biggest problems was not really civilian injuries. One of the biggest problems were women who were pregnant who had had previous cesarean sections. When the French were there, the French doctors, I don't mean to disparage French doctors, but the French doctors performed a lot of cesarean sections. I think when patients were pregnant and did not deliver at a reasonable hour, the doctor didn't want to be called out at night to deliver the patients, so they performed cesarean sections. And they performed the old classical cesarean section, which was a large vertical incision, practically bivalving the uterus. Those patients, when they got pregnant a second time, were at very great risk of rupture of the uterus, as opposed to the more modern technique that we use here, where we make a transverse incision low in the uterus. They made a vertical incision, and that did not hold as well. So it was not unusual to come in the morning and then maybe have 3 or 4 women who'd been bleeding or who had ruptured the uterus, and those were the first patients we had to take care of. We did not save too many of those women if they came in late in their pregnancy and then ruptured the uterus, especially if they ruptured the uterus, say at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and we didn't get there till the next morning. That was a big problem. They also did not have any blood. We used our outdated blood. In the military, in any hospital here, blood usually outdates in 3 weeks. Those Vietnamese patients were all very anemic, and I kept the blood for 5 weeks, and we used that blood to transfuse the Vietnamese patients, and it worked pretty well. I mean, most of the blood was partially hemolyzed, but that's what we used. The biggest problem we had with the civilians, or the most serious problem, I'd say, was the number of these poor ladies who'd had previous cesarean section, and then now were pregnant for a second time, and then ruptured the uterus. There was no obstetrician around to take care of them. We had very little blood, and they really had to rely on our surgical team coming in at 9 o'clock in the morning to take care of them. If they came in at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, we were there at 9, those patients, very often we were able to save. Could not save the fetus too often. We did not have a neonatal intensive care unit. In fact, we did not have any pediatricians there. Midwives took care of the babies. That, I thought, was very, very sad.
Mm. Were you able to follow up on any of your civilian patients?
Yes, for the civilian patients, because they kept them in for about a week. We could see them. We'd be in one week, and we could see them the following week. Most of them that managed to get through surgery. If they managed to get through the surgery, most of them really did very well.
So you went about once a week?
I'm sorry?
You went to that hospital about once a week?
About once a week.
And of course,
if things were slow, at our hospital, at the Marine Hospital, if we weren't taking in any casualties, and we had a lot of free time, and sometimes we'd go to the hospital twice. But usually we'd go out to the hospital once a week, and then once a week we'd go out into the small villages and do our medcaps, take care of the children, women, children, old men, anyone that was willing to come to a medcap. But like I said, those could be harrowing experiences. I remember going on a medcap one time, and we were going into a small village to take care of civilians, and my Jeep was coming over a hill and down towards this little village, and I saw a young boy, maybe 8 or 10 years old, run behind a small concrete building and put his hands over his ears. And I told my driver, stop this Jeep right now and turn around and go back, because he said, what's the matter, Doc? I said, I just saw that kid run around that building and he's sitting behind the building. From the top of the hill, I could see that kid, and he's got his hands over his ears. He's expecting an explosion, and that explosion's probably going to come when your Jeep that you're driving, with me as your passenger, hits that landmine. And I said, I don't know what your intentions are, but I don't think we ought to be driving over a landmine. So we turned around and went back. That's the only medcap that we canceled. I canceled it. I was the ranking officer, so they had to listen to me. That's about the only time I told the driver not to go where he was planning on going.
Were you ever attacked?
Yes.
Or actively?
One time in May, and the weather was about 101 or 102 degrees outside. There were some complaints that some civilians filed with Marine Corps headquarters, and they claimed that some Vietnamese civilians had been killed or shot by Marines. And of course, the Army always, the Marine Corps, the military, always took such accusations very seriously. And there was another surgeon, although I was chief of surgery, there was a Navy surgeon who outranked me, and he said he was willing to go and investigate that allegation. They got a group together with Marine Guards, etc., and sent them out to exhume these bodies and check them out. And about an hour and a half after they went out, the chief came back, and the lieutenant, Marine lieutenant that was with the group said, well, that Navy doctor, he was the ranking officer, got frightened and didn't want to go into that dangerous area. So they came back. The Marines weren't too happy about that. And so the hospital commander asked, was there anybody willing to volunteer and go out there? Well, as chief of surgery, I thought, I should go myself rather than volunteer somebody else to do it. And so I went with my very close friend and vice chair of surgery, George Voss. We went out and they exhumed the bodies. The bodies were on the gelatinous side because they'd been buried for several days in that heat. And indeed, there were about 3 bodies that we exhumed, and they had been shot in the back. We took photographs, and at that point, the North Vietnamese Army was trapped by our army, which was conducting an operation. The North Vietnamese were short of rice, and that was harvest time. So they were in collecting rice from the villagers. We happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. We were between the Vietnamese on one side and the U.S. Army on the other side, and here we were in the middle digging up bodies. And the Army had called in artillery fire, and these Vietnamese were trying to escape, and we happened to be in the way. So we got ambushed, and they were shooting at us, and I had to jump into an open grave with a gelatinous body in there, and George, my buddy, jumped into the next one. And I must say, I've never been so frightened in my life. I told George, I'm so frightened, I'm sweating right through my flak jacket. And George said, I'm bigger than you are, and I'm pouring out more sweat than you are. I said, but I'm just as frightened. Anyway, artillery fire was called in, and unfortunately the radio frequencies for the Marine Corps radio operator that we had and the Army observer in a Piper Cub flying overhead were not on the same frequency. So we had to radio our home base, who then had to radio the Army base, who then had to radio the pilot of that observer aircraft. Please hold off artillery fire until these guys get out of their graves and get out. So we did manage to get out, but I thought for sure that we probably were going to get killed. The bullets were whizzing by very, very close, and it was not a pleasant experience.
Sounds like a horrible experience. What was the result of that?
Actually, what happened was the three Vietnamese that had been killed, they were shot in the back. But there was a very small village, and it's actually that village where we were doing the digging for these bodies. There was a patrol of 7 Marines that had stayed in a small hut, abandoned hut, and they were shooting at some Viet Cong who were helping the North Vietnamese collect rice for the Vietnamese army. And while they were housed in that little Vietnamese hut, these 3 Vietnamese Viet Cong came and fired at them, and they had an exchange of gunfire. The Vietnamese thought that they had killed the Marines, but the Marines actually were not killed. They were waiting for the Vietnamese to come by and check and see whether they were alive or not. So the 3 Viet Cong approached the hut, and when they were close enough, our Marines started firing on them. They turned around and didn't want to halt, and so during the firefight, they got shot and shot in the back. And they were exonerated. I mean, they obviously didn't do anything wrong. It was an open firefight. The accusations were, I think, designed to try and cast some bad light on our Marines, but our Marines did a good job.
Were you ever involved in anything scary that took place near one of the villages where you had gone to take care of them, where the villagers actually might have intervened in your behalf?
No, actually, the Vietnamese were very friendly and very nice to us. The only incident that was scary was that incident where we came over the hill in the Jeep, and the little boy ran behind that hut, and I was fairly certain that they probably planted a landmine right where we were coming down with our Jeep, and hoping to see us get blown up, and we didn't. So otherwise, the Vietnamese were very friendly. They were very appreciative of the care that we gave them. There's one touching story. One day, a little girl came up to me. She must have been 8 or 9 years old, and started tugging on my uniform. And she carried her little baby brother. Baby brother was probably about maybe 1.5 years or 2 years old. So here was an 8 or 9 year old girl taking care of about a 1.5 year old boy. And he had a cleft lip, not a cleft palate, just a lip. And unfortunately, when kids are born with deformities, they're ostracized by the group as a whole. And so she held this little kid brother and asked if I could take care of him. And so through the interpreter, I said, well, let's bring him to the hospital and see what we can do. So about a week later, they brought him to the hospital. And I did a cleft lip repair on the little boy, and fortunately got a nice result out of that. So several weeks later, I was back at the same village, and a little girl came up. She had a candy bar. Some Marine had given her a candy bar, so she was trying to pay me for her little boy's surgery with a candy bar.
Probably the most precious thing she had.
I thought that was very touching.
It is. Were you ever invited into the homes or
Yeah, we
offered food?
We had strict orders not to, no fraternization. It could be dangerous. You didn't know what you were eating. You didn't know whether they were setting up a trap for you. So very strict orders. None of that. We didn't go into any homes, and if I caught anybody in my department that was doing that, they'd be severely punished. So I didn't do it, and none of my officers did it. None of our troops did it.
What about North Vietnamese who were wounded? If they were found, did you take care of them?
Yes, we took care of a few of them. They were brought in by the Koreans. The Koreans had a detachment that was working in our area. They had one doctor, a low-ranking doctor, but all he did was be present to help take care of Korean casualties. And he acted really more as an interpreter rather than as a caregiver. And so we took care of the North Koreans. A lot of them were operating in areas where the North Vietnamese were operating. So they brought back some prisoners. Usually they didn't take any prisoners. They didn't want to be bothered with prisoners. But a few times they brought back prisoners that they thought might be able to give them valuable information, and we had to take care of those.
And then what happened to them after that? I mean, did you turn them back to the Koreans?
No, they were turned over to the military police, and they were brought in for interrogation. So we really didn't know what happened to those patients later on.
Okay. But they didn't stay around any longer than the U.S. patients?
No.
So, okay. What were your living conditions like while you were in Vietnam?
Well, I kept on thinking...
I bet you were sorry you had gone because you couldn't find a place to live.
I kept on thinking about that Navy recruiter, who told me I could sleep, eat at a table with a white tablecloth, and be served by a steward in a white uniform. And I always told my fellow officers, if there's a miserable way to live, the Marines will find a more miserable way to live. So we were there in the mud, the dust, the dirt. But everybody lived the same way, so the camaraderie was good. We had a lot of internal jokes. If you didn't have a sense of humor, you'd have a lot of trouble living through a war. I think that's one thing the Americans had a great advantage of. They had a great sense of humor. Yeah. You can make fun of almost anything, including the food that you eat, the living conditions. But that helped, bring everybody closer together. So that part of it made life bearable.
You were in a stationary place most of the time, so did you have hot meals? Did you have a mess?
Yeah, we had a mess hall. The cuisine was not exactly what we find in some of the finer establishments in Phoenix or Los Angeles or San Francisco. But it depended on how well the weather was holding out so that the airplanes could come in and bring us good supplies. The food was always edible. There was always enough of it. Like I said, we never had to worry about where the next meal was coming from, even if it was out of a C ration box, or who would take care of us. The big problem always was worrying about the civilians. They were undernourished. A lot of the kids had a lot of problems with nutrition or lack of nutrition. We did all right. We did not have any problems. In fact, my buddy George and I, during the Marine Corps birthday, one time went out with our C rations. We traded the C rations for some young pigs, and we had roast suckling pig cooked by a couple of Filipino corpsmen who knew how to do it and did a good job. So we had a big luau, nice roast pig. That was a good meal.
Did you ever get any time away while you were there?
Yes, I was lucky enough to have R&R. I managed to get 3 R&Rs. Everybody was entitled to 1 R&R, rest and recreation period. And my first R&R I took to the Philippines, which is where I was born. And my sister was living there at the time, and she was about to have a baby. So I was lucky enough to get back and visit her. My mother was visiting there at the time, so we had a little bit of a family reunion. It was a pleasant reunion and a sad reunion in a way. I managed to get back to the what would be called the ancestral home. My paternal grandfather was still alive. He was 96 years old at the time. And when I went to visit him, he was a little bit on the senile side. Physically, he was doing very well. He was up and about his big house, and he was an old judge. He was a retired judge. And he was going around dusting the piano and other furniture. I came in uniform, and here's my grandfather calling me sir. You know, asking me, would you like a cup of tea, sir? Would you like some candy, sir? And this was my own grandfather. Finally, he took me into his bedroom, and he showed me a picture of the officer staff, General Aguinaldo's officer staff. There were 98 officers in a huge photograph that looked like a graduation picture. It was a very wide photograph, maybe 6 or 8 inches tall, but probably about 24 or 25 inches wide. And although my grandfather at that point couldn't remember me, probably couldn't remember what he had for breakfast that day, but he pointed out every single one of those 98 officers, and he named every single one of them. So this is 1968 that I went back on my R&R. That photograph was taken during the Spanish-American War, probably around 1898 or 1899. And he remembered every single one of those officers. Unfortunate thing was, when I went back on my way home from Vietnam, and I went back, my grandfather died a few months after that, so I was very fortunate to see him before he passed away. On my mother's side, my grandfather was now back here in the States. He left the Philippines just after the Second World War. He did survive the Death March. He was no spring chicken during that time. Figured Spanish-American War was about 1898 to 1900. He and his brother had run away from home to join the U.S. cavalry. So they were probably in their late teens. Second World War broke out in 1941. The infamous Bataan Death March was in February or March of 1942. So you had 42 years to a late teenager. He was in his 50s, maybe in his 60s. He managed to survive the Death March.
Which come from tough stock.
Yeah, well.
Was there anything that you skipped over that you'd like to tell us about your time in Vietnam? You said you got 3 R&Rs.
I'm sorry?
You said you'd gotten 3 R&Rs. Did you want to tell us about the other 2?
About?
R&R? You got
Oh, yes.
3?
Well, it's unfortunate how I got the other R&Rs. Everybody in Vietnam in the military was entitled to 1 R&R, and I had mine. But once in a while, one of the soldiers that had signed up for an R&R got injured and got evacuated out of Vietnam, and so that R&R slot would be left open. And they always wanted to fill every single one of the airplanes that was going on R&R. And since the hospital was right next door to the R&R center, whenever they had an airplane going out on R&R, and there were a couple of openings, either because the the trooper that was supposed to be on that R&R seat got injured and sent out, or unfortunately he got killed, then there would be slots open. Then they would come to the hospital, knowing that we worked very hard at the hospital, and they would offer R&R slots to any of the staff in the hospital. So I managed to get on 2 extra R&Rs, one to Tokyo and one to Taiwan. So those were my 2 extra R&Rs.
Okay. You were in Vietnam for how long?
1 year.
1 year. And during that time you got some awards, including Bronze Star?
Well, I got a Bronze Star, but, you know, I think anybody that served out there deserved the gratitude of not only our side of the war, but certainly the Vietnamese. I found out later on that although we were occupying a not very large area for our hospital, we were paying the Vietnamese government rent, you know, to occupy that space. So we're paying them rent to fight their war for them and help take care of their folks for them. I think anybody that serves in the military, especially the shooting war, really deserves every bit of credit they can get.
Was that Bronze Star awarded for some particular incident that you want to tell us about?
For several operations that I was involved in, and I was just doing my job, trying to do it best of my ability.
And you got some other awards too, the Vietnamese Service Cross?
Yes, well, on the U.S. side, they give you awards for having served in Vietnam. And then from the Vietnamese side, I got the Vietnamese Cross of Galantry. The Vietnamese also granted us some medals for serving in Vietnam. But I thought I was just doing my job best way I could. Paid back for all the deferments to enable me to finish my education and my training, and for that I was very grateful.
When you left Vietnam, where did you go? And
well, when I left Vietnam, hallelujah, actually I had the chance for one more R&R in November of 1968, and it was an R&R to Sydney, Australia. However, it would have delayed my leaving country, and I thought I would rather get out of Vietnam rather than go on R&R and come back to Vietnam, and what if something happened to me at that very last moment. So when I left Vietnam, I managed to get what they call circuitous travel home. So they permitted me to schedule the travel back to the States any way that I could. So I flew from DaNang to Manila and visited my sister. Then I took my travel from Manila to Japan, through Honolulu, San Francisco, and then back to Washington. And I got back in time for my Thanksgiving dinner back home. So that made up for the macaroni and cheese on the way out.
Oh, I hope so. How was your, how did you adapt to being a civilian? Was that difficult?
No, not at all. Being in a hospital and doing surgery and seeing patients and having a clinic and operating and sitting up with your sick patients, it's pretty much the same no matter where you are. The setting and the location and the people that you work with, those change, but patients are the same. They need your help. You give them all the help they need. Hospitals are not really a brick and mortar. To me, a hospital, people taking care of people. That's what it's all about.
So where did you practice?
When I got
first?
back, I was assigned to the Naval Hospital in Triangle, Virginia, Quantico Naval Hospital. It was a marine facility at Quantico, and the Navy had a hospital there. The hospital's closed now, functions as a large clinic, but that was only about 45-minute drive from home, so that was very, very convenient.
Home being Washington, D.C.?
As I lived in Arlington, Virginia at that time, and Quantico was about maybe 20 or 25 miles south of D.C., so that I was home.
Okay. So you were telling us about the unit that you were served with, the 1st Military Battalion.
The 1st Medical Battalion, for some reason, has never had a formal reunion. About 2 years after we got out of the service, the officers that I served with, mostly the surgeons, and we were a very close-knit group, we went to the Virgin Islands about 2 years afterwards. About 7 of us got together, but that was the last big get-together that we had. I've remained in close contact with most of them. Some of them have passed on. Dr. Stuart Wilson, who is now emeritus professor of surgery at what's now called the Medical College of Wisconsin, where I trained. We stay in close contact. George Voss, who was my vice chair of surgery, we remained very, very good friends until he died. About 15 years after we got out of the service. Dr. Cheryl O'Neill, who is the surgeon that I replaced as chief of surgery, he lives down in Texas, in Tyler, Texas, and we keep in touch. My chief of anesthesia, Dr. Paul Gillis, lives in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and in the wintertime he goes down to Florida. We keep in touch. So the group of surgeons that I worked with and really lived with and shared a lot of trials and tribulations together, we've remained close, those of us that are still alive.
Would you recommend military service for young people today?
Yes, I would. I think that one should not only appreciate what the country has done for you, one should also be willing to serve.
Men and women?
I'm sorry?
Men and women equally?
Yes. I think, well, I have different feelings about women being in actual combat. But women being in the military, I have no problem with that. I think it's a very worthwhile thing to do. But I think, although a lot of women want to be in actual combat, I think if they become prisoners, then they're subject to some humiliation and some abuses that men probably, are not going to be subject to. We're talking about rape and, some very degrading things that some civilizations are not too concerned about what they inflict on women, and not if we capture prisoners, we treat them in a very different fashion from when some other civilizations capture us. So I'd have my second thoughts about women being in actual physical combat, but serving in the military, I think more power to them.
All right. Anything else that you would like to add?
Well, not much more that I can think of without prodding. I can say that life has been very interesting. I'm now 79 years old. Knock on wood, I've managed to come through relatively unscathed. Every life has its ups and downs. I hope that at the end of my days, people can say I gave more to life than I took out of it. That's what I want to say.
Well, I think that will be no stretch for that to have happened. I want to thank you for doing the interview, and to introduce myself, Jolene Pierson. On camera, I have Ed Uzmescus. We have an observer, a couple of observers today, Joe Montedononico and Clint Lisk. Thank you for your service, and thank you for doing the interview.
Thank you very much for this
pleasure.
opportunity, and thank you for everybody here. And Joe Montedononico, who you're going to interview next, is my best buddy.
That's great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.